Welcome back to the deep dive. We are moving into a really critical phase of World War II history. If 1939 was the year the world dramatically slipped into darkness, 1940 was the year that darkness just accelerated with terrifying speed. We saw the dizzying efficiency of blitzkrieg swallowing up Europe's western flank, but by the time the calendar flipped to 1941, something fundamental had changed. Britain held its ground just and critically. The conflict was spreading far, far beyond the European continent.
That's absolutely right. I mean, the first 9 months of 1940, they really defined the war as a lightning-fast German dominance. Our mission today is to take a deep dive specifically into that pivotal last quarter, October through December 1940. We are tracing the geographical expansion, moving from the Battle of Britain's defeat to the intense escalation of the Blitz on the home front, while, simultaneously charting the ideological horrors unfolding in the East and examining the first major Allied military successes that happened further afield.
So we pulled together sources covering these 3 months to really understand how World War II stopped being just a European theater conflict and became a truly global war. We're going to be looking at the unexpected political and military turns in North Africa, Mussolini's disastrous impulses in the Balkans, and that sort of tightrope walk of the American giant, the USA, and the shifting dynamics between Germany and the USSR. Get ready to learn how the map and the nature of the fighting changed completely in those 90 days. Okay, so let's start where Hitler was in the early autumn of 1940. By October, he'd effectively created this massive Nazi empire across Western Europe. France occupied, the Low Countries swallowed. But his core plan, Operation Sea Lion, the invasion of Britain, was postponed indefinitely mid-September after the RAF just refused to be defeated.
And that military failure, it forced a major strategic pivot. When he couldn't break Britain directly, Hitler immediately turned his focus eastward. And it's so vital to stress here that this was not just a tactical maneuver based on resources, though he certainly wanted the resources of the Soviet Union. This was pure core ideology, driven by the beliefs he had laid out decades earlier in Mein Kampf.
And what was the driving force behind that ideological pivot?
In Hitler's worldview, the East, and particularly the Soviet Union, it was the home of the two great evils threatening the German race: Bolshevism, so the communists, and the Jews. For Hitler, these two forces were inherently linked. They had to be eradicated for Germany to achieve its destiny. And we know just how long this determination had been festering. We have documentation from 1922 where he states plainly and just chillingly, "Once I really am in power, my first and foremost task will be the annihilation of the Jews."
A determination that had only intensified by 1940. And with Poland now fully conquered, a country that held the largest Jewish population in all of Europe, the Nazi master plan began to accelerate, and dramatically.
Right. And the initial phase of what would become the Holocaust wasn't mass deportation to death camps. That would come later. The initial stage was the systematic collection and forced isolation of the Jewish population into urban ghettos. The logistics of this early phase were a calculated act of cruelty. It was all designed to facilitate disease and starvation. And the Warsaw Ghetto, it became the epicenter of this initial policy.
So what were the practical, horrific details of the Warsaw Ghetto's establishment in October 1940?
The sheer scale and the deliberate crowding, they just demonstrate the malicious intent. On October 3rd, 1940, the Nazis issued the instruction for all Jews in Warsaw to move into a designated area. And you have to consider these staggering numbers. 380,000 people, that was approximately 30% of the city's entire population, were systematically crowded into an area covering just 2.5% of the city's land area.
Wow, that immediately suggests the deliberate use of environmental factors as a weapon.
It absolutely does. By November 15th, 1940, the Warsaw Ghetto was officially sealed off from the rest of the city with walls that were often 10 feet high, topped with broken glass and barbed wire. The consequences were immediate and deliberate. Disease, primarily typhus, ran rampant due to sanitation collapse, and starvation was widespread. The rations they allotted were calculated to be non-sustaining. The daily calorie intake for Jews was often limited to just 184 calories per day, compared to over 2,500 for Germans.
Unbelievable.
Yeah. And the tragic irony is that those who managed to initially survive the catastrophic, deliberate conditions within the sealed ghettos, they were simply facing a deferred and ultimately worse fate: mass deportation to the extermination camps later on. The ghettos were designed as holding cells leading to death.
And while the Holocaust is rightly focused on the systematic attempt to eradicate the Jews, the Nazi ideological target list, as our sources remind us, was much broader.
That is a crucial historical necessity to remember. The Nazis systematically targeted anyone they deemed racially inferior or politically undesirable. For example, at a high-level conference in Berlin, the Nazi regime decided to expel 30,000 gypsies, or Roma and Sinti people, from Germany and send them east to Poland. Like the Jews, they were destined for death camps such as Auschwitz, where they were typically held in separate sections.
Heinrich Himmler, the head of the SS and Gestapo,
Mm-hmm.
was central to overseeing the logistics of this mass persecution.
Absolutely. Himmler oversaw the systematic deportations and executions across occupied Europe. It's estimated that up to 500,000 gypsies were killed during the war, a figure that represents almost the entire pre-war gypsy population of Eastern Europe. I mean, the scale of the genocide was it was wide-ranging. This meticulous, chilling categorization, it extended even to the daily life inside the concentration camps, where prisoners were branded with colored symbols.
Right, and the symbols themselves tell the story of the Nazi political hierarchy.
They do. Gypsies were branded with black triangles and held the lowest status in the camps, placed alongside the Jews who were identified by the Star of David. But then you have the political enemies, communists, anarchists, and socialists, whom Hitler particularly hated, and they were identified by a red triangle. Which brings us back to the ideological root of Hitler's hatred.
So he didn't just hate communism as a political rival, he saw it as an existential racial threat.
Precisely. His core belief, the very foundation of Nazism, was that Germany hadn't lost World War I on the battlefield. It had been intentionally stabbed in the back, sabotaged by a conspiracy of Jews, socialists, and Bolsheviks on the home front. He viewed the communist ideology, with its core emphasis on universal brotherhood and equality, as completely antithetical to his nationalistic, racialized worldview.
And this fear wasn't abstract, was it? It was rooted in the post-WWI German experience.
Yes. The Russian Revolution in 1917 fueled immediate fears that communism would spill over into Germany. And by early 1919, attempted communist revolutions in German cities like Berlin and Munich were brutally crushed. And who crushed them? Primarily the Freikorps. These were paramilitary groups formed by thousands of returned war veterans who fiercely despised communism. Many of these very men, having established their anti-Bolshevik credentials in street fighting, went on to become senior figures, commanders, and executioners in the later Nazi Party and the SS.
So war with the Soviet Union wasn't just about gaining living space, the Lebensraum. It was the logical culmination of the foundational anti-communist and anti-Semitic ideology that birthed the Nazi Party.
It was unavoidable. In Hitler's mind, war with the Soviet Union was not just necessary for world domination, but an essential step to eliminate the ideological enemy that had, in his view, betrayed Germany in 1918. That Freikorps link, it shows that the Nazi Party was built on a deep-seated commitment to annihilate Bolshevism, which makes the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact even more jarring.
Given that ingrained hatred and ideological mission, the world was rightly astonished when the Nazis and Soviets signed the 10-year Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact in August 1939.
It was a tectonic shock across the globe. I mean, here were two mortal ideological enemies renouncing warfare and pledging neutrality. For many, it just defied logic. But as history quickly proved, the pact was merely a ruse, a tactical maneuver by Hitler to secure his eastern flank while he conquered the West. He considered the Soviets subhuman and ruled by Jewish Bolsheviks. He never intended to honor the agreement long term.
So the moment the invasion of Britain was stalled, the focus shifted entirely, confirming the deceit.
Absolutely. The moment Sea Lion was postponed in mid-September, Hitler intensified the planning for the Eastern Front. By mid-August 1940, even before the formal shift, he was already actively discussing the prospect of taking on the Bolshevik menace with his military high command. He began putting immense pressure on Eastern European countries, Hungary, Romania, Slovakia, to align with the Axis, not just for allies, but specifically to establish logistics, staging grounds, and to expand his resources, preparing a massive southern flank for what would become Operation Barbarossa. He was focused on the East, but first he needed to prevent the rest of Europe from being a distraction.
So with the invasion of Britain off the table, Hitler's immediate goal in the autumn of 1940 was creating a massive continental bloc. The idea was to isolate Britain and strangle its supply lines. And Italy, led by Mussolini, was the established ally in this endeavor, having signed the tripartite pact with Germany and Japan in September 1940.
And the most critical geographic location for this blocking strategy was North Africa, specifically targeting British territory in Egypt. The strategic prize there was almost incalculable: the Suez Canal.
Why was the Suez Canal so utterly vital to the Allied war effort?
It was the literal pathway to the Middle East oil fields. It was a critical artery for moving supplies, troops, and material between the Mediterranean and the Indian Ocean. If the Axis seized it, they gained crucial fuel supplies for their war machine, and just as importantly, they would cut off the entire Allied fuel and supply pipeline that kept Britain and its colonial territories fighting.
Mussolini, who was very eager to participate in this new Roman Empire, launched his offensive into Egypt in September 1940. He was aiming for Sudan, Kenya, British Somaliland, and of course the Protectorate of Egypt. He succeeded in pushing the British back, but then he just stopped. What happened there?
Well, the Italian 10th Army, led by Marshal Rodolfo Graziani, launched its offensive on September 9th. They managed to push the thin British forces back to a position near the village of Sidbarani, west of the main British defenses at Mersa Matruh. But Graziani was deeply, deeply cautious. He refused Mussolini's repeated pressure to press on, citing severe logistical difficulties and a fear of a concentrated British counterattack. So he dug in, establishing a chain of widely dispersed, fortified camps, and just waited for resupply.
That delay sounds like a catastrophic error, both militarily and politically for the Axis.
It was a critical failure of momentum. The Italians remained stalled until December 1940, leaving the vital Suez Canal temporarily in British hands. This strategic halt meant the British could dedicate resources elsewhere and allowed them precious months to reorganize and prepare. It also, it really highlighted the logistical difficulties and tactical weakness of the Italian forces, which is something Hitler was forced to note.
And while the Italians were stalled in the desert, Hitler attempted to secure another prize that would have sealed the Mediterranean: Gibraltar. This crucial British island fortress lies between Spain and North Africa.
Right. To seize Gibraltar, Hitler desperately needed Spanish support. He needed to launch the attack, codenamed Operation Felix, from the Spanish coast, and use Spanish territory as a staging ground. This led to his meeting with General Francisco Franco at the French border town of Hendaye on October 23, 1940.
And this was a high-stakes moment because Franco owed Hitler a debt, didn't he? I mean, Germany and Italy had provided critical aid during the Spanish Civil War. We're talking about the bombing of Guernica, the supplies, the German Condor Legion. Yet Franco proved remarkably difficult. Why was that?
Franco was the master of neutrality by leverage. Despite happily accepting enormous amounts of Nazi and Italian aid in the past, he was deeply wary of inviting large German forces to camp permanently on Spanish soil. He feared Germany would never leave and potentially undermine his newly established authoritarian regime.
So he demanded a price Hitler just couldn't pay.
Exactly. Franco presented a long, almost impossible list of conditions for entry into the war. He demanded the British possession of Gibraltar, territorial gains in Portugal, and large swaths of Vichy French territory in North Africa. Hitler was furious. He found Franco ungrateful and avaricious, and he refused the demand for French territory because he was trying desperately to consolidate relations with Vichy France at the same time, making Franco's proposal a complete non-starter. The negotiations collapsed, and Hitler left deeply disappointed.
But despite the official failure of the meeting, Spain's neutrality was clearly just a convenient facade, wasn't it?
Oh, it was highly biased neutrality. Though officially staying out of the war, Spain provided extensive unofficial assistance to the Axis. They built observation posts overlooking Gibraltar for German spies, they allowed German U-boats to resupply secretly at Spanish ports, and they permitted Italian bombers to refuel at their airfields. We even see records of members of the Spanish embassy in London collecting intelligence information for Berlin. Spain remained a silent, supportive partner for the Axis while maintaining the facade of non-belligerence.
So you can contrast Hitler's political failure with Franco to his immediate success the very next day, October 24th, when he met with Marshal Philippe Pétain, the French prime minister.
Yes, Pétain was a figure of immense moral authority in France, the celebrated WWI hero and victor at Verdun. But by 1940, that authority was used for collaboration. After the Nazis marched into Paris, Pétain replaced Prime Minister Paul Reynaud and signed the humiliating armistice with Germany on June 22, 1940. This handed the Nazis control over the north, the west, and the entire Atlantic coastline of France, the occupied zone.
And Pétain immediately began establishing the new French state.
He did. He established a new authoritarian regime centered in the spa town of Vichy, the unoccupied zone, or Free Zone, which was theoretically independent but functionally subservient to Berlin. Pétain blamed France's liberal democracy for the defeat and systematically dismantled the republic. He famously replaced the Republican motto of liberty, equality, and fraternity with the far more conservative nationalist mantra, work, family, and fatherland.
And this authoritarian shift included an immediate alignment with Nazi policies.
It did. Pétain introduced harsh measures, including anti-Semitic laws that stripped French Jews of their rights even before the Nazis demanded it. His aim was to stabilize France through collaboration and authoritarianism. His final public betrayal was made official 6 days after his meeting with Hitler.
He used a radio broadcast to solidify his position, didn't he?
On October 30th, Pétain declared via radio broadcast, "I enter today into the way of collaboration." This publicly sealed his allegiance to Nazi Germany. And crucially, this collaboration ensured Hitler had control over a massive land area, and unlike with Franco, it secured access to Vichy territories in North Africa, guaranteeing Hitler a strategic foothold on the Mediterranean that was far more valuable than a perpetually demanding Spain.
But just as Hitler was finally stabilizing his western perimeter, he ran into a massive ego-driven problem, created entirely by his own ally, Mussolini, shifting our focus back to the Balkans.
That's right. Hitler was meticulously securing the Balkans as a waiting zone and staging area for Operation Barbarossa. On October 12th, he moved troops into Romania to secure the vital Ploiești oil fields, a critical fuel source for the coming Eastern War. This move infuriated Mussolini.
Because Mussolini viewed Romania as his sphere of influence and felt constantly undermined and sidelined by Hitler's failure to consult him. He was tired of being presented with a fait accompli.
And Mussolini decided to retaliate by creating his own fait accompli to prove Italy was still a powerful partner. He declared, famously, "This time I'm going to pay him back in his own coin. He will find out from the papers that I have occupied Greece." He struck without consulting Berlin at all.
And Greece was strategically vital to Britain. King George II was an ardent Anglophile, and British ships used Greek ports. Mussolini struck on the eve of October 28th, issuing a non-negotiable ultimatum.
Right. The ultimatum demanded that Greece allow free passage for Italian troops to occupy strategic points or face war. The Greek response, delivered by the Prime Minister Ioannis Metaxas, was immediate and succinct. Then it is war. Italian forces crossed the Albanian border, Albania having been seized by Italy in 1939, expecting a quick 2-week victory over the small nation.
But the reality was dramatically different.
The Greeks, fighting on their home ground and fueled by national pride, refused to yield. Despite the Italian military numerical advantage, they were hindered by mountainous terrain, poor planning, and the arrival of an early, severe winter. The invasion was a disaster. The Italian forces quickly began retreating back into Axis territory. By mid-December, not only had the invasion failed, but the Greeks were now controlling a quarter of Italian-occupied Albania, an enormous and humiliating territorial loss for Mussolini.
And this impulsive, ego-driven failure was a massive disruption to Hitler's master plan for the East.
A huge disruption. Instead of the Balkans being a quiet staging ground for Operation Barbarossa, it became a messy, active front requiring immediate attention. This failure would ultimately draw significant German troops and resources southward, delaying the crucial invasion of the Soviet Union. Mussolini, in trying to save face, actually jeopardized Hitler's entire schedule.
So while the Axis powers are wrestling with logistics and ego in the Mediterranean, across the Atlantic, the United States was walking a very careful political tightrope. It was election year 1940, and President Franklin D. Roosevelt had to balance his conscience, a strong desire to aid the Allies with public opinion, which remained fiercely isolationist following the devastating losses of World War I.
The British were losing the Battle of the Atlantic, and they desperately needed American aid. Roosevelt was slowly, quietly maneuvering America toward involvement without triggering a full-blown political crisis. Early steps were taken in September 1940. Congress amended the Neutrality Act to allow munitions sales, shifting from cash and carry to eventually allowing credit.
And we saw the famous destroyers for bases deal.
That was a brilliant stroke of non-interventionist intervention. 50 overage destroyers, which Britain desperately needed to fight U-boats, were sent across the Atlantic. In exchange, the U.S. received Atlantic and Caribbean bases from Britain, technically justifying the action as a defensive move for U.S. security, not just aid to an ally. This marked a serious move toward belligerency while maintaining the illusion of neutrality.
And then the monumental step, the introduction of peacetime conscription.
The Selective Training and Service Act of 1940, passed on September 14th, was the first peacetime conscription in U.S. history. This sent a massive signal of intent. Registration began on October 16th, watched nervously by the entire nation. Secretary of War Henry Stimson drew the first draft capsule, serial number 158. Thousands of men would be called into service.
But despite the political move, the U.S. military was nowhere near ready for a large-scale war.
Oh, far from it. And this detail is so illustrative of the challenge. The vast majority of the newly drafted men were still deeply unprepared for full-scale combat. Many draftees were photographed fighting mock battles using wooden sticks as make-believe rifles and tanks. It just emphasizes how unprepared the country was for a conflict of the scale raging in Europe. The commitment was political. The preparation was still lagging desperately behind.
Roosevelt also faced an immense political challenge that autumn. He was fighting for an unprecedented third term, breaking the hallowed tradition set by George Washington that no president should serve more than two.
Right, Roosevelt had navigated 2 exhausting terms fighting the Great Depression and genuinely considered retirement. But the crisis overseas convinced him he had to stay at the helm. His opponent, the Republican candidate Wendell Willkie, a corporate lawyer and former Democrat, made FDR's third term a central point of attack. Willkie famously declared, "If one man is indispensable, then none of us is free." This tapped into deep American fears about executive overreach and dictatorship.
But the public seemed less concerned about tradition and more concerned about the war. So Willkie shifted his attack to Roosevelt's interventionist tendencies.
He did. He argued that Roosevelt was secretly planning to drag the U.S. into the European War, stating, "FDR's promise to keep our boys out of foreign wars is no better than his promise to balance the budget." This was potent ammunition, playing on American isolationism and distrust of Washington. Willkie's accusations triggered growing Republican support and closed the gap dangerously in the polls.
So how did Roosevelt manage to defend his interventionist policy while simultaneously reassuring the isolationist public?
It was a masterful, albeit complicated, balancing act. Roosevelt repeatedly stressed that his intention was to keep America out of foreign wars, while simultaneously providing aid that would prevent Britain from losing. He hammered the message home, especially in the northeastern states, repeating, "I have said this before, but I shall say it again and again and again. Your boys are not going to be sent into any foreign wars." He had to convince the public that helping Britain was the best way to keep America safe and neutral.
And when the results came in on November 5th, the immense stakes of the war clearly influenced the outcome.
They absolutely did. Roosevelt won handily, securing 27 million votes to Willkie's 22 million. The sigh of relief across the Atlantic was palpable. Winston Churchill, who felt the Axis threat personally, was profoundly relieved. He knew that without Roosevelt remaining in the White House, the crucial lifeline of American support, both current and future, would likely be severed, making the fight against the Axis almost impossible for Britain to win alone.
While Roosevelt was securing his political footing, Britain was fighting an existential war at sea. The Battle of the Atlantic, which had raged since 1939, was taking a catastrophic toll on Allied merchant shipping. Britain, as an island, depended entirely on these transatlantic supplies for food, fuel, and raw materials.
And the consequences were immediately felt on the home front. Supplies were depleting quickly, necessitating wide-scale rationing. It was introduced as early as January 1940 for basics like bacon, butter, and sugar. By the fall, tea and meat were added to the list, meaning queuing with ration books became a commonplace, dreary reality of British life.
And the scarcity extended critically to fuel.
Absolutely. Petrol had been severely rationed since 1939, reserved almost entirely for the military, the RAF, trucks, tanks. The public was forced to rely on public transport or unconventional methods. We see incredible examples of wartime ingenuity, like the reappearance of horse-drawn vehicles in urban centers, and the truly unique inspired method of using large, bulky gas bags mounted on top of cars to supply them with flammable fuel gas. It was a visible sign of national scarcity and determination.
But the biggest factor exacerbating the supply crisis was the fall of France in June 1940. How did that change the naval balance?
It was a tactical disaster for the Allies and a massive advantage for the German U-boat fleet. With France under Nazi occupation, German U-boats gained immediate direct access to the Atlantic from western French ports like Brest and Lorient. This placed them far closer to the main convoy routes, effectively doubling their range and patrol times. Simultaneously, Britain had suffered severe losses, losing 22 destroyers during the Norwegian campaign and the battles around Dunkirk.
And this combination of factors, new bases, fewer escorts, led to what the German Navy infamously coined the happy time.
Exactly. Between June and October 1940, over 270 Allied ships were sunk. The U-boats were operating with deadly effectiveness, often utilizing Wolfpack tactics, coordinated attacks by multiple U-boats on a single convoy. U-boat commanders were celebrated as national heroes and aces in Germany. We're talking about men like Günther Prien, who famously sank the battleship Royal Oak in Scapa Flow and would sink over 30 Allied ships. Otto Kretschmer, who was regarded as the most successful ace of the deep, and Joachim Schepke, Their victories underlined a depth of danger the British were struggling desperately to overcome.
Okay, so to break the Axis pressure and secure the Mediterranean, the British needed a decisive victory. And it came not in the brutal, grinding Atlantic, but with a daring, unexpected strike in the Mediterranean. With Mussolini's troops pushing toward Egypt, supplying British troops from Gibraltar, the length of the Mediterranean made them incredibly vulnerable to the dominant Italian navy.
Right, and British strategists had recognized the threat posed by the main Italian naval base at Taranto early on, well before the war started. Plans for an all-aircraft attack, codenamed Operation Judgment, had been prepared since 1935 during Mussolini's push into Abyssinia and were revised during the Munich crisis of 1938. The British were just waiting for the right moment.
And that moment arose when General Graziani stalled his troops at Sidbarani, freeing up British ships for a major offensive.
Precisely. RAF reconnaissance confirmed on November 10, 1940, that the bulk of the Italian battle fleet was fully in harbor, anchored in the shallow waters. On November 11th, Operation Judgment was executed. It was daring, as they used older, slower Fairey Swordfish biplanes. These planes, known as string bags, were obsolete even for 1940 standards, but they were perfectly suited for low-level torpedo runs.
So how was the attack structured?
2 waves of these swordfish were launched from the aircraft carrier HMS Illustrious under cover of darkness. The first wave consisted of 12 aircraft, and the second, 9. They carried a mixture of torpedoes, specially modified to run in the shallow harbor water and bombs. The element of complete surprise was achieved.
And the result was an immediate, powerful, technical, and strategic shockwave felt across the globe.
Half of the Italian battleship fleet was knocked out in a single night. 3 battleships were sunk or severely damaged, and there was extensive destruction to docks and facilities. The surviving ships were quickly transferred north to Naples, and the Royal Navy instantly gained undisputed naval superiority in the central and eastern Mediterranean. It completely turned the tide of naval conflict in that theater.
So why does Taranto matter so much globally?
Taranto fundamentally rewrote naval warfare strategy. It was the first successful all-aircraft naval attack in history, officially marking the beginning of the end for the battleship era and the clear rise of naval air power. It proved that air-launched torpedo attacks didn't require deep water, which was a critical operational lesson. But the most historically significant implication comes from the Axis partner in the Pacific.
Japan, the signatory of the Tripartite Pact, watching this attack unfold.
They watched with what they described as great interest. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, who was already planning for a potential conflict with the U.S., was profoundly impressed by the offensive efficiency. He realized that a similar attack launched in shallow waters could cripple the U.S. naval fleet before it ever left eastern waters. The Taranto bombing provided the exact blueprint, the tactics, the logistics, and the proof of concept for Japan's devastating attack on Pearl Harbor, just over a year later in December 1941.
The success at Taranto must have given the British a massive morale boost. But on the home front, the terror of the Blitz continued unabated. Field Marshal Hermann Goering and the Luftwaffe ensured that the pressure remained intense.
Oh, yes. Goering, whose reputation had been tarnished after the failure of the Battle of Britain, remember his boast, "If an enemy bomber reaches the Ruhr, my name is not Hermann Goering." He was desperate to maintain the offensive. While the initial phase of the Blitz focused heavily on London, November brought a specific, devastating act of revenge ordered directly by Hitler.
And the catalyst was an RAF raid on November 8th, which interrupted Hitler's annual celebration of the 1923 Beer Hall Putsch in Munich.
Hitler was personally incensed by this disruption of an important Nazi anniversary. He immediately ordered Goering to launch Operation Moonlight Sonata, a revenge attack targeting Coventry. Coventry was the industrial heartland of Great Britain, full of armament factories and aircraft assembly plants.
And on the night of November 14th, 1940, almost 500 German bombers swarmed over the city, and the devastation was immediate and total.
It was absolute obliteration. In a focused attack lasting 10 hours, from early evening until dawn, the bombers released an unprecedented payload. Almost 150,000 incendiary bombs designed to start firestorms, alongside 500 tons of high explosives designed to shatter infrastructure. The result was catastrophic. Transport systems, gas, and water mains were completely destroyed. Over 60,000 buildings were flattened. The city center was obliterated, including the beautiful 15th century St. Michael's Cathedral, which was reduced to a shell.
The human cost was immense, with up to 1,000 people dead and hundreds of unidentified victims requiring mass burials. Yet, in the face of this horror, the British response was one of defiant resolve.
That's the enduring takeaway. The attacks were meant to break morale, but instead they hardened it. Within hours of the all-clear siren, the Home Secretary Herbert Morrison and King George VI made highly publicized, unannounced visits to the ruins, walking among the destitute citizens to offer moral support and demonstrate national solidarity. The spirit was captured in the phrase, "Coventry can take it," a statement meant to show Hitler that the bombings would not stop the fight.
Meanwhile, that period of relative inactivity in North Africa, caused by Graziani's caution, finally came to an end. With the Italians still dug in at Sibirani, General Archibald Wavell ordered preparations for a decisive British counterattack.
And Lieutenant General Richard O'Connor, an innovative military mind, launched Operation Compass on December 7, 1940. O'Connor immediately exploited the fatal weakness of the Italian defenses. Their forces were heavily fortified, but were split into widely spaced, isolated camps across the vast open desert. They had focused on facing the threat coming from the coast, not the desert interior.
So what was the tactical brilliance of O'Connor's attack plan?
His forces, utilizing tanks and mechanized infantry, passed unnoticed through a massive, unguarded gap in the chain of Italian defenses, attacking them from the unprepared rear. They took one camp after another, quickly surrounding and dismantling the Italian positions. The speed was just dizzying. By December 11th, all resistance at Sibirani ceased, and the Italians surrendered.
And the victory quickly grew in scale.
Within days, O'Connor's troops had swept further, seizing Saloum, Halfa, and Fort Capuzzo. By December 15, 1940, Operation Compass had effectively pushed all Italian forces either out of Egypt or into captivity, taking thousands of prisoners and vast amounts of material. This was Mussolini's black moment in the war, a humiliating and complete military defeat that required Axis intervention.
And this overwhelming defeat in Egypt was compounded by the disaster unfolding simultaneously in the Greco-Italian War.
Right. By mid-December, the Greeks were not only victorious, but they were driving the Italians back, controlling a quarter of Italian-occupied Albania. Italy's ineptitude on two major fronts had massive strategic consequences for the Axis war effort as a whole.
So with his Italian ally floundering, Hitler wasted no time. He was fully focused on his ultimate goal, the Soviet Union. He quickly moved to solidify the Balkan tier necessary for Operation Barbarossa, ensuring his southern flank was secure before the invasion.
We see a flurry of diplomatic activity in late November. Hungary, led by Miklos Horthy, committed to the Axis on November 20th. For Horthy and the Hungarian leadership, the choice was terrifyingly simple. The Nazis were deemed the lesser of two evils compared to the powerful, menacing communists looming right on their border. Romania and Slovakia quickly followed suit on November 23rd. This successfully created a northern Balkan tier along Russia's southern flank, crucial for staging troops and supplies.
And despite objections from high-ranking officers who saw the inevitable danger of opening a two-front war, Hitler ignored all warnings.
He was completely ideologically driven, dismissing his generals' logistical concerns. Within weeks, Hitler confirmed his intention to invade the Soviet Union, setting the codename Operation Barbarossa, with the date initially scheduled for May 15, 1941. The largest and most destructive land invasion in human history was now officially scheduled, moving the center of the conflict eastward.
As the year drew to a close, the shift in the United States finally became official. On December 29th, President Roosevelt delivered one of his most important fireside chats.
This was a watershed moment. It marked the definite public decline in U.S. isolationist policy. Roosevelt spoke directly to the American people, warning them explicitly about the tripartite pact between Germany, Italy, and Japan, describing it as an unholy alliance of power to dominate and to enslave the human race. He emphasized that neutrality was no longer possible in the face of such global evil.
And he set the tone for the coming year with a really memorable declaration.
He delivered the phrase that would define America's role in 1941 and beyond: "We must be the great arsenal of democracy." He stressed that America's massive industrial capacity must be mobilized to supply those fighting the Axis. And he concluded by warning the public, "For us, this is an emergency as serious as war itself." This was the public commitment the Allies, and especially Churchill, had been waiting for since 1939.
Even as Roosevelt was delivering that monumental warning about the struggle for democracy, the bombs were raining down on the British capital once more. This was the most devastating air raid on London to date, happening just 4 days after Christmas.
Germany had commenced their bombardment with renewed, cruel enthusiasm, targeting the historic city with a combination of high explosives and incendiary devices. This massive assault created what was immediately dubbed the Second Great Fire of London, starting around 1,500 individual fires across the city.
The German strategy for this particular raid was almost unbelievably cunning, designed to maximize damage and panic.
It was. They deliberately chose a night when the Thames River was at its lowest ebb on record. This complicated things immensely for the overwhelmed fire brigade. Vital water mains were shattered by the high explosives, forcing firefighters to combat the firestorm using the thick mud and slime of the low river to try and feed their hoses. It was a horrific, prolonged battle against both fire and engineered scarcity.
Although the all-clear sounded at midnight, the battle continued throughout the following day.
The firestorm raged for 15 hours. However, amid all that systematic destruction, we have that one image of enduring national hope: St. Paul's Cathedral. Although the fire raged all around it, the cathedral was saved thanks to the dedication of volunteer fire watchers and workers who put themselves in immense danger to protect the structure. It stood as a potent symbol of resilience, promising that even though the battle continued, the events of late 1940 and the changes coming in 1941, specifically the clear American commitment and the Allied success in North Africa, would bring genuine hope to those still fighting.
It's truly astonishing to look back at the chaos and complexity of October through December 1940. We've extracted some critical historical connections, from the terrifying, calculated logistical efficiency of the Warsaw Ghetto system to the technological shockwave of the Taranto attack and the immense political drama of FDR's unprecedented third term. This quarter fundamentally changed the map and, crucially, the nature of the fight.
The overarching synthesis is clear. The conflict definitively globalized. Germany failed to subdue Britain directly and was therefore forced to look east to realize Hitler's ideological goals. And critically, Italy's disastrous ineptitude in Greece and in Egypt acted as a gravitational drag, drawing German resources southward and away from the Eastern Front. And that delayed Operation Barbarossa and made the Axis War far messier and more expensive than Hitler had originally planned.
We transitioned from purely fearing what Hitler would do next, the invasion of Britain, to seeing the Allies finally start to make calculated, meaningful headway. Operation Compass and the Taranto raid proved that aggressive resistance was possible, even as the terror of the Blitz peaked over cities like Coventry and London.
And the historical irony here is just immense. It's really worth considering long after this deep dive ends. The Taranto raid, carried out by the British to protect the Suez from Italy, provided the strategic blueprint that Japan, Germany's ally, would use to cripple the American fleet, inevitably drawing the U.S. into the war that Churchill desperately needed them to join. That intricate connection between events thousands of miles apart is what truly defines this pivotal turning point in 1940.
If you found these critical historical connections and insights compelling, and you want to keep receiving these deep dives into incredible historical narratives, please consider supporting the channel. We rely on your support to bring you the full, unvarnished history of the Second World War. You can purchase official War Stories merchandise, including our new historical map series, by clicking the shop link in the description. Your support helps us continue this vital work.
Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the closing months of 1940, where the battle for survival expanded into a battle for global dominance. We look forward to seeing where the conflict leads next in 1941.
We'll catch you on the next deep dive.